Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another in our Integration Developer News Executive Webinar Series on Enterprise Integration and SOA through the Lifecycle. This is Vance McCarthy, your moderator for today's session, which is entitled Microsoft and SOA Governance. Presenting on today's topic today, I'm pleased to be joined by two experts. Steve Sloan is Director of Product Management for the Developer Platform Group at Microsoft, and Alistair Farquharson, Chief Technology Officer at SOA Software. Let me quickly introduce our speakers for today's session. At Microsoft, Steve Sloan is responsible for Microsoft's enterprise developer platforms, Windows Server, App Fabric, .NET Framework, and the Windows Azure App Fabric. He led product management and marketing for BizTalk with a focus on SOA, BPM, and enterprise integration, and knows well the trials and tribulations of end-to-end developer requirements, as before joining Microsoft, he helped launch an XML web services security firm, which was later acquired by Cisco. Steve, thanks for being here this morning.
Vance, thanks so much.
Alistair Farquharson, as CTO at SOA Software, spearheads the product design, architecture, implementation of SOA management, and governance for the company. He is an expert in application development with a focus on distributed environments, SOA, and scalable systems. And prior to his post at SOA Software, he advised top CTOs and enterprise architects on Internet and SOA architecture issues. Alistair, thank you for being here today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
In today's session, these two executives will describe how Microsoft's enterprise developer offerings and SOA software have combined to bring you design, deployment, and governing options for SOA and integration projects. We will learn specifically how to rapidly integrate Microsoft-based SOA technologies with existing J2EE and web services SOA projects, best practices companies and developer teams are using to design, launch, and test SOA governance and management end-to-end for Microsoft and non-Microsoft environments, control SOA costs via faster design and implementation, ensure end-to-end SLA, security, and policy compliances, and simply automate contract and policy management with provisioning, access control, and other requirements. And notably, all these insights are going to be equally applicable to a wide variety of Microsoft SOA portfolio technologies, including BizTalk Server, ESB Guidance, the Windows Communication Foundation, Windows Azure, .NET Framework, and the App Fabric development environments. By the end of this session, in short, you will see the power of Microsoft and SOA software, whether your project is for a simple department or will span across the enterprise or even across the globe. One housekeeping item before we begin. To see the slides in a larger window, simply click the gray enlarge slide button at the bottom of your screen. And to ask a question of either speaker, all you'll need to do is minimize that view, and you'll get right back to our Ask a Question box. So lots to cover here. Let's get started with Steve Sloan of Microsoft. Steve.
Great. Thanks, Vance. It's been interesting. Over the past 8 or 9 years, one of the big changes we've seen in the way applications are built across almost all application types has been the emergence of services. And that has been a cross-cutting theme across general service orientation, the emergence of composite applications, a greater use of model-driven tools for creating and managing those services. At the same time, that's been accompanied by trends which include scale-out and internet-scale applications, increases in the demands for availability of products as they sit across multiple nodes, and finally, the two things that have been ever present with us, and in this latest economic environment have been maybe even more important, are not just the requirement to deliver applications to the business, but to deliver those in the most cost-effective way possible. And so as we look at the confluence of these trends, service orientation and subsequently this issue of service governance has become one of the more important issues that we'll see. And today we'll talk a little bit about why we think this trend will continue. So as we look at this picture before you here, let's think for a second about how we historically have built applications versus a service-oriented world. So imagine this is a line of business application. That could be a Salesforce automation application. That could be a customer self-service app. Each of the components that you see before you have historically, number one, all lived on premises, that is in your own data center. And number two, many of these components were contained within a single monolithic application. And one of the changes we've seen most in the past several years has been the componentization of an application like this down into services, number one. And number two, one of the things we're seeing now is a greater reliance on services that don't just sit in our own data centers. So these are cloud-based services. So as an example, if you have an order management system, you see people using cloud-based services for things like sales tax calculations. In other cases, you might need to reconcile information against credit checks and those sorts of things if there's some sort of consumer transaction. As these applications become more componentized, and we think about each of these different pieces, whether it's the client front end, it's the business logic, the order logic as is shown in this case, the data on your back end, or the data that are coming from other line of business systems or from the cloud, if we think of these as service nodes as opposed to just components of an application, you get two benefits really. The first benefit is that it allows you to compose these applications based on not just the components that you already have, but components that might have been built previously for some other purpose. So you get flexibility and reuse. The second thing you get is the ability to evolve this application over time without having to change all of it. So as new requirements come, which they always seem to do, especially if an application is working well, what you can do is just add those new components on as opposed to rewriting the entire application. So with the componentization and the creation of services becoming a much more mainstream way to architect and build applications, we at Microsoft have been working on a number of components in the platform to make it easier to build, manage, and deploy these. And what we'll talk about a little bit later on is the important partnership that we have with SOA Software around governing these. But first, I'd love to talk just a little bit about some of the Microsoft components which make it easier to build, deploy, and manage those services. So three of the components that we'll talk a little bit about today include the .NET Framework, and in this case, two technologies in particular, Windows Communication Foundation and Windows Workflow Foundation. The second is a new portion of Windows Server that we just recently announced called Windows Server App Fabric, which makes it easier to build, manage, and scale those services. And the final component is BizTalk Server, which makes it simple to connect line of business systems and services from across a range of environments, whether those applications were built using Microsoft technologies or they come from IBM, Oracle, any number of other providers, or they're custom applications that have been operating in somebody's data center for quite a long time. As we think about what Microsoft is doing to make it easier to build and manage these applications and services, we can think about the broad range of technologies that we're bringing to bear in order to make this simpler. But again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges that emerges as these services proliferate is the governance of those. And this is where we've partnered with SOA Software. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alistair.
Thanks a lot, Steve. So SOA Software essentially provides, as Steve mentioned, SOA governance. And there's a couple of key principles around SOA governance that literally makes a developer's life a lot easier. And certainly anyone who is tackling an SOA as a transformation initiative within an organization, it actually makes and lowers the cost of their total cost of ownership for their SOA infrastructure. So SOA Software has several products that really allow enterprise to achieve this services orientation. And a services orientation is really around a transformation of the way that IT interacts with the business within an organization. What we found with our customers over the past 2 years is that IT has become a lot more aware of the business, a lot more agile, and a lot more responsive to business needs. And more recently, with the economic crunch, IT has had to sharpen its focus on things that deliver shorter value or more immediate value to the organization and strategic in nature. There's no longer really the ability for IT to be disconnected from the business as a whole. And really what this means is that the way that IT delivers applications is changing into more of a services delivery model. So what this means is that your IT service development processes actually need to change to align more closely with your business initiatives. It means that the problem around enabling a service-oriented architecture within an environment is one that is more people and process-driven than really technology. And the key to really aligning people and processes within your IT organization is to provide a framework and to automate and to govern the development of those services and the proliferation and consumption of those services. So ultimately, SOA Software's products actually enables this governance automation process. We reduce the risk of enabling SOA and bringing around a services orientation within your IT department, and we also ease the compliance of services within that larger governance framework. When you're looking at across our product set, and I'll be talking through some of the items in our product set shortly, we focus on three key areas. The first one is around planning. This is where you actually ensure that the services you build are aligning with your business initiatives and certainly aligning with your strategic IT initiatives. So when you're looking across the set of services that you could be building, the planning governance activities are really refining that process, distilling that process down to the set of services based on plan and priority and based on alignment with the business and strategic IT initiatives that you have within your organization. Then there's the concept of development governance. To lower the overall cost of service development, you really want to make sure that people are doing it the correct way, that they are building the right services, and they are building those services the right way. And what this means is that you actually want to control the development activities, you want to control the development process, and you want to make sure that people are not duplicating development activities. You want to make sure that they are not building something that hasn't been approved or something that doesn't align with your IT strategic initiatives. And then last but not least, there's the concept of operational governance. And operational governance is around ensuring that the services are actually running correctly. This is actually not a simple task. With the move to a service orientation, applications are becoming more and more distributed. What I mean by distributed in particular is that they actually cross organizational boundaries. And that is a somewhat a new challenge that our IT organizations are facing today, is that you have a lot of different participants in the delivery of a single composite application. And every single one of those component parts of that application has a separate application lifecycle. It has separate owners, and it has separate centers of responsibility and separate cost centers. So the concept of operational governance becomes really important to align the activities around root cause analysis, for example, for a problem, to align the rollout of services and their interdependencies, and to understand at a high level where and what is going on within your distributed services application or composite application. Microsoft and SOA have had a partnership now for many years. SOA Software has put 5 years or more investment in the technology stacks provided by Microsoft. We've been deployed with the ESB guidance toolkit with BizTalk. We have a dedicated R&D team based in Atlanta that follows and keeps up to date with the Microsoft technologies. And we're also a Connected Systems Technology Advisor and a Gold Partner for Microsoft. And what this means to our customers is that we keep up to date and current with the Microsoft technology stacks. So there's an ongoing collaboration between the two companies around technologies such as WCF, the ESB, BizTalk, Azure, and of course the new App Fabric. Looking again at SOA governance, there's a couple of very common challenges that all of our customers face. The first ones, of course, are lifecycle related. And what this is essentially the act of measuring and proving the value of SOA. And it's actually not a very easy thing to do because the costs of SOA are distributed amongst a large group of people. As I mentioned before, they are distributed applications or composite applications. And then, of course, the actual enablement for SOA is actually one step away from building and delivering the composite applications that SOA provides the foundation for. So most of our customers have concerns and challenges around actually proving the ROI around SOA. And I'll talk a little bit about how that can be done with effective planning and development processes in a moment. The second lifecycle-related concern is that our customers try to control the proliferation or duplication of unnecessary services. This may seem obvious, but it's actually not very easy. An organization is, again, very distributed, and services aren't necessarily described the correct way to be able to spot any common services or any duplication of service efforts. The next thing that is always challenging is controlling the life cycle of a service all the way from its inception or conception or bright spark idea all the way through to production and ultimately to deprecation. And the life cycle within organizations is typically quite complex. There are different development teams with different application life cycles across different times, and they're not always synchronized, and there are multiple steps and multiple branches to that life cycle process. And then, of course, the actual use of the services is complicated by the fact that an enterprise and an organization has very practical requirements around security and monitoring and standards interoperability that requires a certain level of education and a certain amount of discovery before they can be effectively used. So if you want to create a set of shared services, they need to be adequately described, and the complexity of those shared services needs to be abstracted from the consumers of those services. Then there's a set of operations-related concerns. Centralized control of that distributed environment is always a challenge. Most of our companies and most of the people that we work with have a very heterogeneous environment and a very disconnected environment in terms of organizational responsibilities and boundaries of control and boundaries of security. So managing all of that in a centralized manner with multiple technology stacks and multiple organizational boundaries or partners or businesses within that environment is a challenge. End-to-end security, I look back over 15 years, and security is still the number one concern that organizations have when they are dealing with application development and certainly the sharing of information across organizational and business boundaries. That is still the case. The standards are there, but the standards are not that easy to implement. Then there's reliability and performance. The challenge with a distributed architecture like a services orientation is that you're no longer wholly responsible for your performance. You are now dependent on other people that need to perform adequately for you to be able to perform adequately. This is an area that needs to be addressed and an area where sufficient tools and sufficient visibility is required to actually pinpoint problems and ensure a sense of confidence within an organization before individual groups are really keen to adopt or expose services themselves. And then there needs to be abstraction from change. And change control within a distributed environment is complicated. The different components within the environment, if you change a schema, you're no longer just affecting your service, you're also affecting all the consumers of your service. So you need to be able to abstract and you need to understand the change control processes within a services-oriented architecture. So to solve a lot of these problems, you really need to apply a unified governance process. And what this does is ensures a consistency of policy across all the life cycle stages. It ensures a consistency of policy across a heterogeneous environment and a consistency of policy across these organizational boundaries. You need to create, for example, planning policies that mirror different target environments, such as internal development systems or internal applications, cloud resident applications like Azure, or third-party SaaS providers. So we're finding that SOA is actually bringing in a lot more participation or a lot more collaboration between your internal IT groups that traditionally hosted siloed applications and now SaaS providers or partners or even completely different computing models such as Azure and the App Fabric is providing. So the different target environments are critical in the understanding of your SOA and the understanding of the interdependencies within your SOA environment. The other key thing to planning, as I mentioned, is an alignment with business. So today we can no longer afford to build services that nobody uses. Our customers, by and large, are building services that make money and have a return on investment and a short-term term on investment. So alignment with business is a key factor in the effective planning and prioritization of the various service candidates within an environment. And then, of course, alignment with different strategic IT initiatives. The great thing about SOA is it really focuses IT initiatives around bringing return to a particular investment. But what we found over the course of the last year is that return on investment can actually be maximized or amplified if you actually coordinate it with other strategic IT initiatives. We're talking with organizations today that actually no longer want to just move to SOA, but they want to move to SOA and they want to actually modernize their legacy platforms, and they would like to actually move it into something like Azure that's cloud resident. So they want to change their operating model, and they also want to change the way that applications are exposed and consumed within the environment. So an alignment with these different strategic IT initiatives is really important when looking at SOA as a whole, in that you can get additional leverage and additional amplification of a return on investment if you can coordinate these activities together. You don't have to wait for 3 revs of a particular application before you can get a modernization initiative or a master data management initiative, plus a services orientation, plus a shift to the cloud. You can do that in a single iteration of the application and realize more benefit earlier on with a smaller amount of investment. So that's planning policies. So planning policies really drive the prioritization of a set of service candidates that then get developed and deployed into a variety of different environments with different cost models and different justifications. Once your organization has decided to actually build a service, you then need to make sure that that service is built correctly. So now we get up to development policies. And development policies cover things like compliance and validation to ensure that a service can actually be consumed by the people that would like to consume that service, that you're managing the demand for that service effectively. So if somebody logs into the product and says, well, I want to consume this service at 300 transactions per second, but you know that it costs you $1 for every transaction, you can now make an informed decision as to whether you want to allow that person to have access to that service or not. And this is applicable not just in a B2B scenario, it becomes really applicable within an organization as well. Constructs and business practices that used to apply to just B2B services are now being applied internally when you're looking at a service orientation between different organizational groups within a company. Simple things like dictating a service level agreement that you would like to the operations person responsible for hosting your system and getting them to agree to a particular service level within a particular time frame and automating the monitoring and management of that service level is something that is vitally important to our customers today. And then, of course, there's the concept of propagating standards. So along with a service orientation comes a more disciplined approach to application development and service discovery as a whole. I personally believe you can't do SOA without sorting out things like organizational ontology, without sorting out your schema management, without sorting out change control and version management within your organization. So a move to SOA corresponds with a lot of formalization or a lot of decision-making around what you're going to be doing in each of these practice areas within your organization. Many of our customers would use our products, for example, to propagate standardized schemas and ontologies throughout their organization to simplify the process of creating services, consuming services, and describing services. And these are some of the things that come along with the general move to SOA. Then there are operational policies. So once your services have been planned effectively and then developed appropriately, you now need to, of course, operate them and operate them with a lower total cost of ownership. So the operational policies cover things like virtualization. How can I abstract my consumers from my service providers? And how can I manage that change? And how can I version services? And how can I mediate between different standards types and different transport types to make my service more tolerant to a broader set of consumers? Practical things like routing. How do I actually route between different data centers? How do I route on failover? How do I route services based on content? How do I monitor services? So an integration with Microsoft System Center. How do I propagate events? How do I send emails when things go wrong? How do I notify various consumers of various activities that are going on with the service? And then more pragmatic things like caching and denial of service are all things that fall within the operational policy management aspects of an SOA. And the most important thing about operational policies and development policies and planning policies, while I'm at it, is that these policies are applied in a heterogeneous way, in a consistent way across all the different platforms and operational or organizational groups that are exposing services. Then there's a set of cross-cutting policies that actually present the most opportunity in terms of automation within an SOA. If you go with traditional tools and you try and implement an SOA, you're going to have a lot of disconnection between planning, development, and operational governance. And the reason for that is that there's no common way of describing security and service level and capacity across those different phases of the life cycle. So if a developer was using Visual Studio and wants to consume a service, there's no way today for that developer to specify a service level agreement they would like, or a capability around a set of security policies that they are willing to comply with. With our tool set, that becomes possible. And those security policies and those service level policies are then seamlessly and automatically enforced and monitored in the operational environment. So what that means is that, in essence, you're lowering the total cost of ownership of your SOA infrastructure. If the same policies that are agreed to and approved in design time and development time are automatically and seamlessly applied in an operational environment, that means that you don't need to actually go in and modify those systems by hand or control those systems by hand. The product sets that we provide are actually automating the access control and monitoring activities within the operational environment to meet the previously agreed to security policies and service level policies that were decided during development time. And that's a really, really important concept, is that operations kind of becomes hands-off and automated to a large extent through the processes and procedures and workflow activities built into the product set. So some of the key capabilities that are required within an SOA infrastructure. Service lifecycle management, as I discussed, really revolves around automating the business model that you're trying to achieve with SOA. Our customers vary from groups that would like a shared services model, where there's a man in the middle. Within one company, there is a shared services group that consumes everybody's services and then re-exposes them out to the rest of the organization. So if you're trying to enforce a business model like shared services, you really need a product that automates and manages that shared services model and really participates in the control of that shared services model. So the development teams that can log in can only see their services and the shared services provided by the central group. They can't see other development team services. Some of our customers want to delegate the administration of their SOA environment or delegate parts of the administration, like potentially they would want to centrally control security policies but delegate the provisioning of services. So all of these business models and best practices that an organization puts into place are better expressed and better communicated through a product set that automates and controls how that takes place. Then you want to, of course, ensure that your existing services are clearly described, and that's through appropriate lifecycle management, appropriate change control, appropriate classification of services and compliance on services, and appropriate workflow and approvals. You also want to manage the visibility of services across organizational boundaries and across different service types. Many of our customers want to hide services of a certain type. So if your service is developed from the bottom up by right-clicking on a class and saying expose this as a service, then that needs to be suppressed at the organizational level. But if a service is designed from the top down through the creation of a composite app, for example, or with a business process in mind or a business need in mind, then those services are good candidates to be shared and exposed across the entire organization. So the product needs to actually encompass that service visibility and that access control within the user experience. And then, of course, versioning and change control. I've mentioned this before, but most of the complexity around service lifecycle management is around managing versioning of services and managing change control, and understanding what all of the dependencies are between services and their consumers, and in turn, those consumers' consumers, and the composite applications that sit above them. So the concepts of change control have really changed with the advent of service orientation, and it's become more complex and more participative and more distributed. The other capability the products provide is demand-side provisioning. So when you're looking at SOA, what you're really trying to do is create a service brokerage. Maybe you don't need to make real money, but at some point you're going to have to justify your existence, and you're going to have to illustrate how the services that you are exposing to the enterprise are actually saving the business money. And if you have correctly planned for the appropriate services, and you've correctly maintained the appropriate KPIs, and preserved the state of the service meta model, and got the approvals along the way, and justified that service is going to actually be used, then it's far, far easier to actually come up with a return on investment for the services that have been provided. If you ignore planning and you ignore development governance, then it's very, very difficult to find out what the source of the motivation was for a particular service. And if you have no operational governance, you also don't necessarily know who is actually consuming that service. So the concept of a service brokerage goes far beyond just operational governance. It incorporates planning and demand management and billing and reporting. And these are the things that will actually drive value and allow you to determine what the return on investment is on a set of services that you're exposing. The other capability that the products provide are around contracts. And I've alluded to this previously, but contracts are the relationships between consumers and providers. So an SOA infrastructure really needs to treat a consumer of a service as a first order. And what I mean by that is you should have more consumers in your SOA environment than you have services. If you don't have more consumers, you're doing something wrong. If you don't have more consumers than services, it means that you have a lot of one-to-one relationships and quite a few probably zero-to-one relationships. And this is typically the result of just going wholesale and exposing a bunch of services without any credible business justification or any demand for that particular service. So a contract is there to actually formalize that relationship between a consumer and provider. And that contract provides you with a certain number of capabilities around change management, for example. It provides you with capabilities around provisioning of a service, access control, and SLA enforcement. So during the development process, if I initiate a contract for a service, and that contract is approved, when I send a message using the tool set, and I put that message out, it will actually be intercepted by that service and will actually be processed. So the contracts encapsulate the service level agreements, it encapsulates the security policies, and it encapsulates the access control. And if the contract is approved, that means that that developer or that consumer of that service is assured that when they try and send a message on the wire, it will get through to that service and be returned to them with a particular service level agreement and monitoring and auditing around it. So the contract is a design time artifact that actually becomes or matures into a concrete operational access control, SLA enforcement, and policy management entity. Then there's the whole concept of policy management itself. What we try to do with our product is we try to abstract consumers and service providers from policy. Policy is complicated, and policy needs to be centralized and centrally managed. If you rely on your developers to comply with policy, or rely on your developers to be able to effectively consume policy, you're going to spend a lot of your time policing your development teams. You're going to spend a lot of time training your development teams on policies. If you look at services, even simple things like HTTPS is or can be very, very complex. And that doesn't even start scratching the surface of web services-based security policies. So the concepts of encryption and signature and the various tokens for authentication, Kerberos, NTLM, these are concepts that you don't want to continually retrain your developers on and have your developers become familiar with every single time they need to deploy or consume services. You want to abstract the complexities of security and monitoring from your different development teams. And then you actually want to apply it consistently. So irrespective of whether the service is running on JBoss and being consumed by BizTalk or being exposed on the App Fabric or being consumed by .NET, you want them to have a consistent understanding and application of policy. Without that, you have no hope of being able to effectively govern that environment and be assured that the policies you're creating are actually being enforced and implemented in your runtime environment. Last but not least, you really want to close the loop. And I've alluded to this a number of times through the presentation. But things that you've agreed to during the design and development stages of the lifecycle need to be transparently enforced in the runtime environment. It needs to be seamless. It needs to be automated. If I go and provision a service from my registry, I need to be ensured that I don't then have to manually go and configure a security system. If I provision the service, it's provisioned. Why can't that person access that service? So the act of provisioning services and the workflow and approvals around provisioning a service at design time should, at the appropriate time, automatically translate to access control rules at runtime. And the reporting should be provided back to the consumers and providers of those services in a seamless way. And that's what I mean by closing the loop. Closing the loop implies that a lot of the drudgery around managing and provisioning services is alleviated from the people responsible for managing the services-oriented architecture. So I've spoken at a high level about the requirements and capabilities that a SOA governance set of products provides. SOA software provides several key products to automate SOA governance. The first of which is our Portfolio Manager product, which provides planning governance. The second of which is Repository Manager, and Repository Manager governs the development process of services. Both Repository Manager and Portfolio Manager interoperate with Visual Studio to provide developers with a seamless experience when they are consuming and producing services. It also interoperates with Team Foundation Server to manage the dependencies between the processes, the underlying services, and the source code responsible for exposing those services. When you look at operational governance, we provide a product called Service Manager. And Service Manager is integrated with WCF, irrespective of the container in which it resides, as well as the App Fabric and Azure platforms, to provide operational governance and security across Microsoft technology stack, and then also consistently apply the same security policies and governance activities into the rest of your heterogeneous environment. Across the entire life cycle, we have a single product that manages the promotion of services all the way from the identification stage, ultimately through to deprecation. And it manages the policies across that life cycle. And that's called our Policy Manager product. So the Policy Manager product provides security policies and SLA policies to developers, and also at the same time provides the same agreed-to policies to the runtime environment where they are enforced. So as I mentioned, the Portfolio Manager and Repository Manager product integrate with Visual Studio, Team Foundation Server, and Visual SourceSafe for organizations that are still using VSS to provide the integrated planning and development governance activities. Policy Manager provides consistent policy management, and Service Manager intermediary provides virtualization and decoupling of .NET services, and our agents provide the monitoring and operational governance of any type of SOA service on WCF, whether it be in BizTalk, IIS, or a console-based application. As an example, looking at BizTalk, we provide pipelines and adapters within the BizTalk framework to actually secure and monitor and dynamically create and enforce policies within the BizTalk application. So any inbound service calls are protected by the organizational policies that you put into place, and any outbound service calls from BizTalk automatically comply with the security policies that have been created for the downstream application. And this is really useful for Microsoft developers, or BizTalk developers in particular. You're going to be integrating with other systems within the environment, legacy systems, Java systems, packaged applications. And every single one of those systems is going to be controlled by a different organizational unit. And they're going to have their own security policies and service level policies. With our product, what we've done is we've abstracted those SLA policies and security policies into a central location. And we share them equally across the heterogeneous environment. And what this means is that when you make a service call outbound from BizTalk or any WCF application, we automatically configure that service call to comply with the next hop policy. So we're abstracting the security configuration from the application developer. You no longer need to concern yourself with how that organizational team is securing their service. Our product understands how it's being secured, and we provide capabilities within BizTalk to ensure that any call to that service will automatically be complied with. From our product, you can also see how that other service is performing and see what service level agreements they're offering for that service. So we create an environment within our product where you can share information, share policy, and communicate that policy effectively to the various runtime environments. In the same way, all the services that you're exposing will automatically be compliant with the policies that the managers and enterprise architects have put into place in the product. And the policies that you're enforcing will probably be the same as the policies that are being enforced across the larger heterogeneous environment. Last but not least, we also provide the seamless integration into the Visual Studio environment. So we're not necessarily asking developers to learn a new tool set. The experience of consuming a service and providing a service is integrated into the existing experience that they have today. So from within Visual Studio, they can choose to participate in the workflow of provisioning a service. They can automatically generate services based on services registered in the repository, and they can automatically select security policies and SLA policies straight from the Visual Studio environment. The workflow communication would probably happen out of band through email communication. So if they choose to consume a service, but that requires a certain amount of approval, they'll be notified by email once that approval has been made. So the developer can continue to work inside their familiar tool set, which is a great benefit and overall lowers the cost of training within an organization. So in conclusion, an effective SOA really rests on a fundamental change in the delivery model and processes for IT. And I go back to my first point where SOA is not about technology. SOA is around a change in process and a fundamental change in how you deliver services and a fundamental change in your alignment with business. And if you don't accomplish that change, you're going to struggle to really quantify a return on investment for the services that you build. You become disconnected from the business, your services are going to be the wrong kind of service, or they're not going to be consumed by the remainder of the environment. So an effective SOA requires an alignment with business and a fundamental change in the delivery model that you are sort of accustomed to. The way to actually perform that change is through SOA governance. So SOA governance is really around directing or shepherding this change. It really is around less of the stick and more of the carrot. What you're really trying to do is you're trying to encourage appropriate behavior rather than punish inappropriate behavior. And what that means really is providing a framework and automating a lot of the governance practices that you have. It should be easier to build the right service than build the wrong service. So effective SOA governance really has to address the people and the policies and the processes that you have in place. Last of all is the technology. So SOA governance and building the right service in the first place really has to address the organizational and process issues within the environment. And it has to provide automation around the approval and business models and practices that you have in place. The other takeaway is probably around handling SOA governance earlier in the life cycle. As I mentioned before, trying to measure a return on investment of a service that hasn't been appropriately planned or aligned with IT initiatives is going to end in disappointment. You really need to plan your services right from the very beginning and build the appropriate services in the first place. And that's what I mean by early cycle SOA governance model. It accelerates the development of the appropriate services and accelerates the way that IT meets business initiatives and the way that IT accomplishes its own strategic goals. And then the last takeaway is it is also really important to get a product set that closes the loop on all of these governance activities. So if you're planning a service and that service needs to be built, it needs to seamlessly flow into Visual Studio and Team Foundation Server. When that service hits a runtime environment like Azure, it needs to seamlessly enforce the security policies that have been agreed to. So closing the loop between policy definition and enforcement, between auditing and compliance, overall lowers the cost and complexity of that SOA infrastructure. So that's all I have for today. And I'll be handing back to Vance for the Q&A.
Excellent, excellent. Alistair and Steve, thank you very much for a very wide-scoping presentation. You both tapped into many topics which are of keen interest to our attendees. I can see by the questions that have come in. So with your permission, let's get right to questions.
Great.
Sounds great.
You know, one of the themes that I think you both touched on is this idea of trying to balance between business benefit and expense or outlay to get that benefit. So what I wanted to do was group a couple of these questions together. Let's begin with this one, which I think hits the tone. We are budget constrained for new technologies and even new training. What are the top ways that the Microsoft SOA software partnership can help me accelerate or simplify an SOA project?
Sure, Vance. That's actually one of the questions we get all the time, and there are really two big benefits when we're talking about services here. The first is service reuse. So one of the huge benefits of componentizing as opposed to monolithic applications is that you can reuse those services. What that means is that in many cases there won't be as much net new development in order to either create new capabilities within an existing service or application or to create a new one. You can use the components that have been used in other places in the past. The second is that because all these capabilities are built into the platform and built into the tooling, it means that the teams that are working on this, whether those are developers that are building it or systems management teams that are working on the services once they're deployed, they don't have to learn new skills. And so when you take familiar tools, components that are built into the platform, it means that the net new work, training to be done is much more limited.
Great, Steve. And Alistair, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, absolutely. Looking across the life cycle, I think one of the important things is ensuring that people don't build unnecessary services. The cost of building a service is not insignificant. So ensuring that the services that are being built are being built appropriately and actually have a business model and actually have a set of consumers in mind, overall saves money. The second thing is, of course, the cost of change. And the cost of change is responsible for probably 70% of IT budgets today. Or what our product set actually provides is the ability to design the service appropriately in the first place and lower the number of change events on a service or lower the frequency of change events on a service. So if you build a service and design the service appropriately in the first place, you're going to lower the overall cost of ownership for a particular service. So deploying our product set, A, ensures that you don't build too many services. B, ensures that you build the services that really make some money. C, that you've actually put some thought into that particular service. Then more pragmatically, of course, as the service gets deployed, the product set is abstracting the complex activities around security. So you no longer have to worry about or train people on how to secure a service. That kind of gets done automatically by the product set. And then last but not least, you're also automating the security activities around access control. The number of touch points along the way and the number of people that need to get involved and the time that it takes to deploy a service is dramatically lowered if you're leveraging some product that automates that process so that services get deployed and provisioned automatically through a product set will, over time, lower the cost of ownership for those particular services. One of the great examples is that in B2B provisioning, customers that have used our product have lowered the total number of hours that they spend onboarding customers by 90% by providing a way that the whole provisioning process is automated and providing a way that all the security and access control is automated.
Excellent, Alistair and Steve. Thank you both for giving us such a thorough look at this balance between technology and return on investment. In fact, Alistair, in your conversation, you mentioned the concept of the abstraction of policies at a higher level for integration. And the question came in on that. What other aspects of SOA Software's SOA governance can help me bring Microsoft resources into a current J2EE-based integrated environment and even simplify that task?
Well, Microsoft's done a great job of simplifying web services security. .NET has great capabilities around the latest standard support. The problem with that is that not everybody in an environment, especially an environment that you're currently maintaining, has those same capabilities. So if I'm going and deploying a .NET application into an environment and I have a requirement for some security, that security is going to be implemented using the standards today. And the problem is that a legacy J2E environment, for example, doesn't have those capabilities. So what you want to be able to do is use a product like ours to uplift those platforms, those legacy platforms, those partners, those packaged applications, to the same level and the same understanding of security policy. And then furthermore, you actually want to abstract the management of those security policies into a central administration system so that the .NET applications are conforming to security policies and the Java applications are conforming equally, and all of the consumers don't have to deal with the complexities of that security policy themselves.
Excellent. That J2EE Microsoft concept is certainly a popular one. Here's another one among our questions about cloud and Azure. The question reads, our developer teams are keen to use Azure for enterprise requirements and are particularly interested in hearing about your partnership and how it can beef up management and governance for the cloud. Can you detail those?
What we're doing is making it very easy for teams to get up and running very quickly with these new services which are hosted in the cloud, which are run by Microsoft. One of the reasons that we're excited about our partnership with SOA Software is our ability to take, again, the existing infrastructure, the existing tools, and the existing knowledge and extend it. And I think Alistair can talk a little bit about what SOA Software is doing in terms of making it easy to manage those services just as you would any other on-premises service. Thanks,
Steve. Yeah, similar to Microsoft's own principle of making Azure as seamless as possible to the developer. I mean, we're extending our capabilities into the cloud. We're providing cloud services brokerage capabilities, and we are going to be enforcing and implementing policy as if Azure and the services running on Azure were running inside the local network. And I think that that's important when it comes to creating services that sit in Azure that are enterprise class. The definition of enterprise class means that you're assured of its scalability, reliability, performance, and security. So to the extent that Microsoft and SOA Software can actually provide security and assurances around performance and scalability, the services deployed within Azure would be acceptable to any enterprise. And then it just comes down to a matter of cost. Deploying services in Azure and deploying services internally, which one makes the most sense for the business? So we're trying to get IT and the complexity of security and the concerns around performance and availability off the table and bring it back down to a business discussion around which is the best fit for the organization.
You know, that's an excellent point. In fact, let me claim the moderator prerogative here and follow up a little bit on that comment. Steve, in his presentation, talked a little bit about how as we get into services architecture, many of the assets we might want to use or reuse aren't built homegrown, so to speak. They reside somewhere else. Is there some combination between Microsoft and SOA software that makes it easier for developers and architects to assess those services, see if they're going to require any extra work to deploy them well?
Yes, absolutely. When you're looking at the planning governance aspects of services, you're not necessarily planning whether you should build a service or not. A lot of the planning activities are around which SaaS provider can provide me with the capabilities that I need. So during the planning phases of a service lifecycle, you would be also considering and modeling the services provided by SaaS providers and leveraging those services as if they are internal to your organization. So a lot of our customers are focusing on their core capabilities and really outsourcing or leveraging SaaS providers for those capabilities that they don't consider to be strategic to their environment. So we see a lot of customers today within their planning activities and certainly within their development activities, modeling different SaaS providers and dealing with different SaaS providers, their cost models, comparing one to the other, figuring out the different security capabilities of each of the SaaS providers, and coming to conclusions around whether or not to build it internally, whether to outsource it, or to leverage something off the shelf through a service interface. So we see a lot of that for the planning and development activities. For the actual runtime activities, for operational governance, what you really want to do is you want to virtualize those services internally. So it needs to look like that service is running on your local network. Whether it's running in Azure as your own deployed code in Azure, or whether it's coming from a software as a service provider, you need to be able to still control that service and manage the security and access to that service as if it is a local service. And the Service Manager and Policy Manager products virtualize the service endpoint within a local network and control and manage and report on the availability of that service without relying on reports and security provided by the vendor. So it gives your developers and certainly your business users a single throat to choke when it comes to leveraging SaaS providers.
That's a terrific point. That kind of level of certainty, or at least a level of visibility, is something that a lot of our attendees, I think, could definitely benefit from. I see we're coming to the end of the time for this session, but I think we can fit one more question in that I think is another important topic here. And the question reads, it sounds like the SOA software Microsoft partnership might make it more efficient for me to test and provision services. If so, could you please detail? This concept of the SOA lifecycle is another theme that came up during the question period, so I throw that out to both of you.
Absolutely. So the fact that we have products that span the lifecycle, of course, means that we have products that span the provisioning and testing of services. And one of the key things with SOA governance is that you're crossing different organizational boundaries and you are trying to interconnect different application lifecycles. So one of the biggest concerns that an organization has when they're deploying a service is, number one, has that service been tested appropriately? And number two, are all of its dependencies tested and deployed? So you're no longer looking at the isolated deployment of a single application in a silo, but you have to consider where and when your dependencies are in their life cycle. And a lot of that depends as well on the state of their testing. So providing a particular consumer with visibility into lifecycle stage and the state of a testing of a particular service will give them the ability to make an informed decision about their own deployment and their own lifecycle. If I'm looking at a service and I see that it hasn't started its testing or that its testing is failing, what that'll mean is that I have a certain amount of dependencies, or it'll set off a red flag for me that I need to actually go and ensure that this other application team is up to speed. If you see, for example, that a service that you're depending on is being deprecated, then you certainly need to, A, be informed of that, and B, potentially take corrective action, or at least find out how long they're going to be supporting that particular version, or if the next version is backward compatible. So you're no longer developing in isolation. So it covers the provisioning of services and the provisioning of all their dependencies, and certainly an understanding of the testing and the results obtained for the testing of that particular service. So as an example, many of our customers have this concept of certification. So you can't actually expose an enterprise service without being certified. And being certified means that you're willing to support a version of a service for a particular length of time, that your service has a certain amount of availability, and that a service has a published set of test cases, a published interface, and a specific set of test results. So our product actually encapsulates, stores, and publishes those test results and those conditions and agreements and contracts with the consumers of that particular service.
An interesting point, Steve. It looks pretty clear that the vision behind the Microsoft App Fabric architecture is to make that as seamless to the developer's ordinary way of working as possible. In other words, you want to make sure he doesn't have to take a lot of time to be trained or learn a lot of new minutiae to get this end-to-end aspect to SOA governance applied to his code.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Whether a developer is building an application or a service to be deployed on premises in Windows Server or in the cloud through Windows Azure, we'd like to make it as easy as possible, and we're able to do that because there's a single app model in both cases.
And just to highlight, the core technology that we've been talking about this morning is not just a plug-in module or a way to get some sort of generalized UI. Working together, you both have actually pulled some particular technology that makes all these powerful governance capabilities easy to access and monitor, right?
Exactly. So there are things that we've done in the platform ourselves, but what's also important to note here is, and this is something that Alistair mentioned earlier, is the partnership we've had with SOA Software over the past several years, in which they've built extensions that make it simple for Windows Communication Foundation-based services, as an example, to be governed. And so this is a place where the components that we've built in the fundamental platform, as well as the components that SOA Software has built, make the management and governance of these services much, much more simple.
Perfect. So between the two of you, we have sort of a 1 + 1 = 3 situation, which is always terrific in these tough economic times. Steve Sloan from Microsoft and Alistair Farquharson from SOA Software, we thank you both very much for taking so much time today to explain the virtues of end-to-end SOA governance with Microsoft and the SOA Software partnership, and especially for taking so many questions today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.